Well, I wanted to write stories for myself, and at first it was purely an aesthetic thing about craft. Wanted to become quite good at just the art of something, and writing was very private. I also thought of doing improvisational jazz, and I did take lessons for a while, but I tried to write fiction by making up things that were completely alien in my life. That about a girl whose parents were educated or were professors at MIT. You know, there was no Joy Luck Club. It was the country club. It was, you know, this life, and I tried to copy somebody's style that I thought was very clever. Because I thought I was clever enough, you know, to write as well as these people. And I didn't realize that there is something called originality and your own voice. So one day after, you know, being told one of these stories didn't work, I thought, well, I'm just going to stop showing my work to people, and I'm just going to write a story, make it fictional, but they'll be Chinese American. And what amazed me was I wrote about a girl who plays chess, and her mother is both her worst adversary and her best ally. And I didn't play chess, so I figured that counted for fiction, but I made her Chinese American, which made me a little uncomfortable. And by the end of the story, I was practically crying because I realized that although it was fiction, and none of that had ever happened to me in that story, it was the closest thing of describing my life, of the feelings that I had, of these things that my mother had taught me that were inexplicable or had no name, this invisible force that she taught me, and this rebellion that I had, and then feeling I had lost some power, lost her approval, and then lost what had made me special. And it was a magic turning point for me. I realized that was the reason for writing fiction. Through that, this subversion of myself, of creating something that never happened, I came closer to the truth. And so to me, fiction became a process of discovering what was true for me, only for me. I went to a writer's workshop, met a wonderful writer there named Molly Giles, and she looked at my work and said, where's the voice, where's the story? There's so many things that are happening that are not working, but there's a possible beginning. If I were you, I would start over again and take each one of these and make that your story. You don't have one story here, you have 12 stories, 16 stories. And she was right, because those 16 stories became the Joy Luck Club. You know, and I was at a stage where that kind of criticism didn't dishearten me at all. It made me so excited, because she had said it in the most constructive way of not simply saying, this isn't working, this is bad, this is nothing. She said, look at this. Here you have a voice, and it's inconsistent with this voice, but it's an interesting voice. So maybe you should think about this question. What is your voice? That's the question I still ask myself today as a writer. I had an agent who, by luck, read my stuff in a little magazine, wanted to be my agent, believed in me as a fiction writer before I ever believed in myself. In fact, I told her when she wanted to be my agent, I said, oh, well, I'm not really a fiction writer. I don't need an agent. But if I ever write anything else, you know, maybe 10 years from now, I'll let you know. And she pursued me, and she kept saying, you have to write more fiction. I said, well, you know, I can't pay you anything. She said, no, I'm by commission. You don't have to pay me anything until I sell anything. I said, well, fine. You know, you want to be my agent and not make anything. I thought, boy, is she dumb. And she hounded me until I wrote a couple more stories, and then she sold that as a collection called the Joy Luck Club. Well, I took this trip to China as a way of fulfilling a promise, because I had thought my mother was going to die, and I had sworn to God and Buddha and whatever spirits are out there that I would do this if she lived. And, you know, by God, the little mother pulled through. So I went to China, And I was nervous about it because it was meant 3 weeks with my mother, and I had hardly spent more than a couple of hours with her in the last 20 years alone. And there we were going to be. So it was a chance for me to really see what was there inside of me and my mother, most importantly. I wanted to know about her past. I wanted to see where she had lived. I wanted to see the family members that had raised her, the daughters she had left behind, the daughters who could have been me or I could have been them. And I did see all of those things and even more. I discovered how American I was. I discovered how Chinese I also was, by the kind of family habits and the routines, things that were so familiar. I discovered a sense of finally belonging to a period of history, which I never felt with American history. You know, when you read about the Civil War, a lot of people, like my husband, can say, well, my great-great-grandfather fought in that war. We have the gun and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And, you know, I have a good imagination, but I could never imagine my ancestors having been in any of this history, because my parents came to this country in 1949. So none of that history before then seemed relevant to me. And it was wonderful going to a country where suddenly the landscape, the geography, the history was relevant. And that was enormously important to me. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way for everybody, but for me, it was extremely important because I had spent so long denying that side of me. And in fact, one of the subjects I hated the most was history. I thought it was completely a waste of time. It had absolutely no relevance. And today, I love history. I find it is absolutely relevant to everything that is going on. And it's not just some philosophical babble of, you know, how things repeat themselves or, you know, you see the undercurrents of change and culture, and that is history. And it's those behaviors that are important, that history really is a record of behaviors and intentions and actions and consequences. So I think going to China was a turning point, and I couldn't have written the Joy Luck Club without having been there, without having felt that spiritual sense of geography. I used to think that my mother got into arguments with people because they didn't understand her English, and, you know, it was because she was Chinese. And I saw in China that she got in arguments with Chinese people. You know, she was just as difficult in China as she was in America, you know, and I had to laugh about that. There are so many things that I could laugh about, you know, and see that, oh, my sisters were the same way, you know, that we had inherited things from my mother, but there were differences as well. And my sisters who had grown up thinking that they had been denied this wonderful, loving, nurturing mother who would have understood everything and been sweet and kind and never would have criticized them. Suddenly they were shocked to find this mother who's always, you didn't cook this long enough, or this is too salty, you know, and why do you wear that? It makes you look terrible. And they were shocked too. It had nothing to do with being American. They were daughters also wanting their mother's approval and didn't understand why their mother was so critical. So I saw my mother in a different light, and I think, you know, we all do that. You have to be displaced from what's comfortable and routine, and then you get to see things with fresh eyes, with new eyes, and the new eyes can be very useful in breaking habits of relationships, the old irritations. The patterns of avoidance. You start talking about things, and you still get into fights, but then you learn to just pick what's important and say, it's not so important really for me to win this. And really what my mother wants is for me to think that what she has to say is valuable. That's all. I get asked that question a lot, and I never know the answer. The answer keeps changing. Sometimes I think that it's pure luck. I won the lottery. Sometimes I think it's because I'm a baby boomer, and what I wrote about are very normal emotions and conflicts that many people have, and so somehow it struck a universal chord. I think that I was in the right time at the right place and met the right people who were passionate about my work, and thus able to get it in front of people who would sell the book in bookstores, readers who would pass the word along to their mothers or daughters or friends. And I think it's all of that. But I also begin to think that there are these things in life that we don't understand, that are a mystery, that the cumulative experiences that we have led to some great plan that we can't fathom. Maybe we'll never be able to completely fathom, but that's somehow all part of it. And by that, I give credit to something beyond me. And I'm not sure what that is exactly, except I think it's a very benevolent force. A lot of bad things have happened in my life, and I never believed the sort of pap that ministers would say, bad things happen for certain reasons. God, decided to take your brother at this time for a reason. And I thought, bullshit, Why would somebody allow such pain to happen to anybody? And I look, and I don't think it's so difficult. It's almost, we don't have words to explain why things happen, and that you can't crouch them in terms like that and explain them at the moment that they happen. It's only later that you see what the connections might have been and how it led to something. And but then again, I think that's why I'm a storyteller, that I take all these disparate events that have happened in a story that I've put together, and I have to connect them. I have to make them seem inevitable and yet surprising and plausible. And that's what I think life is like, too, that I have the luxury to do exactly what it is we all need time to do, and that is just think about the mystery of life. I didn't fear failure. I expected failure. I think I've always been somebody since the deaths of my father and brother who was afraid to hope. And so I was more prepared for failure and for rejection than success. And the success took me by surprise, and it frightened me. On the day that there was a publication party for my book, I spent the whole day crying. I was scared out of my mind that my life was changing, and it was out of my control, and I didn't know why it was happening, and I thought it would ruin things. Because at that moment in my life, I was fairly happy. I was getting along with my mother. My husband and I had been married for a long time. We were happy. We had our first house. We had great friends. We were doing well. We weren't starving. We had a comfortable living. And I thought, things are going to get messed up here. And I have no control over this, because I could already see how people were treating me differently. That's a scary thing. When people say, how has success changed you? You have to say, no, how have people changed toward you as a result of success? And how have you dealt with that change in how people have changed toward you? That's the most difficult thing. So I went through a terrible period of feeling that I had lost my privacy, that I had lost a sense of who I was, and that I was I was scared by the way people measured everything by numbers, where I was on a list, or how many weeks, or how many books I had sold. And so that by the time it came to the second book, I was so freaked out. I broke out in hives. I couldn't sleep at night. I broke 3 teeth, grinding my teeth. I had backaches. I had to go to physical therapy. I was a wreck. And I started a second novel 7 times, and I had to throw them away. 100 pages here, 200 pages there. And I'd have, is this what they liked in the Joy Luck Club? Is this the style? Is this the story? No, I must write something completely different. I must write, no Chinese characters and prove that I'm multi-talented, or no, I must write this way in a very erudite way to show I have a way to use big words. And it's both rebellion and conformity that attack you with success. It took me a long time to get over that, and just finally being able to breathe again and say, what's important? Why are you a writer? Why did you write that book in the first place? What did you learn? What did you discover? What was the most rewarding part of that? Don't think of what's going to happen afterwards. If it's a failure, will you think that what you wrote was a failure? That the whole time was wasted? If it's a success, will you think the words are more valuable? And I think that crisis for me helped to make me define what was important to me. And it started off with family. It started off with knowing myself, with knowing the things I wanted as a constant in my life. Trust, love, kindness, a sense of appreciation, gratitude, that I didn't want to become cynical, that I didn't want to become a suspicious person, that I didn't, and those were the things that helped me decide what I was going to write. My mother, meanwhile, all the time kept saying, write my true story. That's all you have to do. Write my true story. And I kept saying, no, that's not fiction. I'm not writing biography. And I thought to myself, writing is an extreme privilege, but it's also a gift. It's a gift to yourself, and it's a gift of giving a story to someone. What better gift can I give my mother than to finally sit down and listen to her entire story, hour after hour after hour? She's very repetitive, so this is hard work, listening to her say the same laments in her life over and over again, but really this time asking for more details. And getting this story out, and I realized, it was a gift that she was giving me, and it was a gift I could give back to her. And it didn't matter what happened to that book afterwards. If it didn't sell a single copy, if it, was panned, that whole time I spent writing it, getting to know my mother, getting to know myself, all of it was worth it. Nobody, no review, no place on a list could take that away from me or make it more important than what it already was. And so, I still have to think about that over and over again in everything I do in life. It's so easy to get derailed by success. You get distracted. You get, opportunities, and if I look back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I would not be able to believe that I would be saying, no, I don't want to make another movie. No, I don't want to do a TV series. But these are the things where you can get sucked into the idea that, gosh, this is impressive. Maybe I should do this. It'll look good. And then I think to myself, or I'll write like this because it'll impress that critic who likes such and such. And I think to myself, if there is, I think a lot about death because of what's happened in my life. And I like to hope that there's something after death. And I like to hope that if there's something afterwards, the people I love will be there. So I say, if I die, who's going to be waiting for me on the other side? That critic or that movie producer or that TV exec? Or is it going to be my mother and my husband and my brother? And gosh, it simplifies things a whole lot. You know, it just crystal clear what's important. I was told what I was supposed to do when I was growing up. And so I don't think I ever had a chance to think about what I really wanted to do. Deep down, I wanted to be an artist. But I knew that you couldn't make any money being an artist. That was just play. My parents told me I would become a doctor, and then in my spare time I would become a concert pianist. And so both my day job and, you know, my spare time was sort of taken care of. And I think it really terrified me when I got to a point in my life wondering if that was something I really could do. Did I have the ability? You know, I wasn't that good of a pianist, and I didn't know whether I really wanted to help people who were sick and had diseases, and, you know, was that really in me? Let alone, you know, could I pass a science course? I did do some writing when I was young, just as everybody did in classrooms. I had to write, you know, the little essays and things like that. And I wrote an essay called What the Library Means to Me when I was 8 years old. And it was very simple. It said things like, my name is Amy Tan. I'm a third grader at Matanzas School. And then I did what my father always did. He was a minister. And I tried to be very sincere, you know, sort of go for the emotion, you know, about how the library is a friend. And this really all was very sincere. But at the end, this is why I think I won this essay contest. I made a pitch for money, which, of course, is what ministers do at the end of their talks. And I said how I had given, I think it was 17 cents, which was my entire life savings at age 8, to the Citizens for Santa Rosa Library, and that I hoped that others would do the same. And so they decided to give me the award. They published my little essay, and they gave me a transistor radio. And at that moment, there was a little gleam in my mind that, you know, maybe writing could be lucrative. But I kind of forgot about that later because, again, my parents said, you're going to be a doctor. It wasn't until I was 33 years old that I decided to try writing for myself. That's when I started writing fiction. You know, I look back, I'm an adult now, and I say, they only wanted the best for you, parents. But at the same time, I try to remember, and this is what I try to do as a writer, I try to remember what those emotions were like when I was younger and how they just didn't understand. They just didn't know who I really was. And they didn't know just how much the smallest amount of recognition would have meant to me, and how the smallest amount of criticism could undo me. My parents had very high expectations. They expected me to get straight A's from the time I was in kindergarten. I remember I was in kindergarten and there was a little girl who I didn't think was a very good artist. I thought I did very careful house, you know, with the chimney and the windows and the trees. And she was more of an abstract artist, and hers was very loose, and, you know, I didn't think it was very good. But they decided to pin hers up in the principal's office. So that was like getting the A. And my mother wanted to know, why wasn't my picture in that window? And I was very wounded and frightened, you know, why wasn't it in the window? And I remember feeling that pressure from the time I was 5 years old. My mother had also a very difficult childhood herself, having seen her mother kill herself, so that she didn't always know how to be the nurturing mother that we all expect we should have. I remember once one of my playmates from around the corner died, probably of leukemia, and my mother took me to this funeral. And she took me up to see Rachel, and I saw Rachel's hands clasped over her chest, and her face was bloodless, and her hands were flat, and I was scared, because this was the little girl I used to play with. And my mother leaned over to me, and she said, "This is what happens when you don't listen to your mother." Talk about pressure. Here was a little girl who didn't listen to her mother. According to my mother, she should have washed her fruit, and she didn't. And it turns out my mother might have been right, that pesticides had led to leukemia and killed this little girl. My mother, back in 1950, had 56, 57, had this theory. But that's what she really meant. And she had been raised in an atmosphere of fear, that the fear was the way to control the child for the sake of their own good. And that's what I grew up with. Now, growing up in an American culture, of course, I also had other models, these playmates who, their parents were, hey, if they got a C, who cares, Great, that was great, Billy. Here's money to go out and get a candy bar. Well, if I came home with one B, I didn't get anything. I got scolded for that one B. And so I grew up often thinking that I would never, ever please my parents. And that is a difficult thing to grow up with. And I know high-achieving kids go through some aspect of that, whether it comes from their parents or their teachers or themselves, or an implied sense of their worth being determined by others. And it's a horrible feeling, especially when you experience what you think is your first failure and you think your life is over. No more chances. That if you blew it, you got a D on something because you stayed up all night and something happened and you weren't feeling well and you took the test and you got a D, that was it. My mother actually believes my older brother, was devastated, that his life was devastated by something that happened to him similar to that. He was a straight A student, brilliant, was going to graduate at age 16, and a friend asked if he could look at his paper. There was some English paper. He'd written a paper on, I don't know, the loved one or something like that. And this friend copied his essay word for word. And the teacher failed both of them, not just for the paper, but for the semester, as though that he was going to teach them a lesson. And I thought the lesson that he taught my brother was a total disillusionment about the consequences that are meted out in life. And I suppose if my brother had become older, it would have transmogrified into something different and made it a strength in his life, a turning point. But he despaired, and he went into depression, and he began to sleep a lot. And a few months later, he began to have headaches. And a few weeks later, he began to have convulsions. And a few weeks after that, he was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And my mother believes to this day that that incident in his life caused his illness. Now, I don't think that necessarily is the case, but I think there is this profound effect that these failures can have on us, and that oftentimes people, parents, teachers, don't realize how these very things that seem little, a little praise, a little criticism, a little failure, can turn into such an enormous turmoil in a young person's life. Well, I remember all of my teachers, and I think of them all as being very kind and dedicated. And I remember one teacher, I was in a school in the 3rd grade, and they were thinking of skipping me or something, putting me in a higher grade, but then somebody said that would be bad psychologically. So for that entire year, because I had learned all the lessons that year, the multiplication tables and the whatever the reading was, this teacher let me go off by myself and draw pictures. And so I had hours and hours of time where I was just left to my own devices, drawing pictures, and she would encourage me. And that was a wonderful period in my life. I mean, I didn't become an artist, but somebody let me do something I loved. What a luxury to do something you love to do. I'd still like to have that luxury, to be able to just sit and draw for hours and hours and hours. And that's, in a way, what I do as a writer. I just sit by myself. That whole quality of being in my own mind, not being directed at what I should be doing moment by moment. Not having a clear plan set out by anybody, and just letting imagination enter into the blank page. So that respect, I can thank Miss Grudoff of the 3rd grade for allowing me that. Reading for me was a refuge. I could escape from everything that was miserable in my life, and I could be anyone I wanted to be in a story, through a character. It was almost sinful how much I liked it. That's how I felt about it, that it was this, if my parents knew how much I loved it, I thought they would take it away from me. And I think I was also blessed with a very wild imagination, because I can remember when I was at an age before I could read, that I could imagine things that weren't real. And whatever my imagination saw is what I actually saw. Some people, of course, would say that was psychosis, but, you know, I prefer to say it was the beginning of a writer's imagination. If I believed that insects had eyes and mouths and noses and could talk, that's what they did. If I thought that I could see devils dancing out of the ground, that's what I saw. If I thought lightning had eyes and would follow me and strike me down, that's what happened, you know. And I think I needed an outlet for all that imagination, so I found it in books. I also grew up, thankfully so, with a love of language, and that may have happened because I was bilingual at an early age. I stopped speaking Chinese when I was 5, but I loved words. Words to me were magic. You could say a word and it could conjure up all kinds of images or feelings or chilly sensation or whatever. It was amazing to me that words had this power. And I don't know where I got that feeling, possibly from my father, since he was a minister. He could say words in church and make people go up there and pledge 10% of their money. You know, that was powerful. You do the same, you know, as a writer, you do the same thing today. You write a book and you hope somebody will go out and pay $24.95 for what you've just said. But I think books were my salvation. Books saved me from being miserable. I loved fairy tales when I was a little kid. I mean, grim, the grimmer the better. I loved gruesome Gothic tales. And in that respect, I liked Bible stories because to me they were very Gothic. You know, very Gothic to have a little boy killing a giant, you know, somebody's head being served on a platter, dead people being raised out of the grave, and things like that. And also because the the rhythms. I think the prose style of the Bible is, of course, very influential, has been very influential on many writers. So as stories, I loved fairy tales, anything that had a degree of the fantastic. I suppose what some people would call today magical realism. Later, I loved, as many children love today, all the Laura Ingalls Wilder books. Little House on the Prairie, Little House in the Big Woods, By the Shores of Silver Lake. I read all of those. And then I felt very grown up when I was able to read To Kill a Mockingbird, and I was only about 10 years old. And I was trying very hard to see if I understood the whole book, because it had a lot of big words in there. But I tried to read more adult books around then. I read a book a day when I was a kid. My family was not literary. We did not have any books in the house. I remember we were given one book of Chinese fairy tales when I was about 8 years old. And the other books we had in the house, besides Bibles and medical textbooks of physical anomalies, were World Book Encyclopedia and condensed Reader's Digest books that had been sort of discarded by various people. So that's what I grew up with, and I meet writers these days, some of who, I remember one writer who sat at the foot of Thomas Mann and was reading Flaubert in French, when she was 15 or something. I wonder what kind of writer I would have been if I had had that kind of privileged upbringing. But I don't regret it at all, because, I grew up in a family that didn't speak English that well. A lot of people couldn't understand my mother. Nobody really cared that much about literature, although my father, I think, was a natural storyteller, being a minister. And yet there was a lot of storytelling going on in our house, family stories, gossip, what happened to the people left behind in China, the gossip about people's character that went around as my aunt and my mother shelled peas on dining table covered with newspaper, overhearing things being said in Chinese that I wasn't supposed to understand, which is the only reason why I understand some Shanghainese and Mandarin. And being told that there were certain books I couldn't read, which made me go out deliberately and find those books. The forbidden things were a great influence on my life. I was forbidden from reading Catcher in the Rye. I was forbidden from reading The Herod Experiment, and also a book called Psychopathia Sexualis, a Krafft-Ebing text from the 19th century. And when it was discovered that I was reading this, my parents called in the family minister to counsel me, actually the youth minister. And the youth minister said how this would corrupt my mind and, I would go insane and all this kind of stuff. We were seated in my parents' bedroom on my parents' bed. And I have to tell you what was so profound about that is that here this man who I was supposed to trust was telling me about these things. And suddenly he saw that I was very sad, because at the same time my father was in the hospital dying. So he says, "Oh, cheer up, it's not that bad." And he threw me on the bed and he started to tickle me. Now, even at that young age, being very innocent, I knew that what he was doing was wrong, and he would not stop. And I found out later that he had seduced a young girl, left his wife, a 16-year-old, and ran off with a 16-year-old, And because of that, it's also made me hate. I cannot stand being tickled to this day, but it made me disbelieve everything he had to say about books being bad for you. That I was intelligent enough to make up my own mind. That I had not only freedom of choice, I had freedom of expression. And I think that, in part, also made me a writer, a certain stubborn streak. And I'm not advocating for disobedience to authority, just in general, because, that doesn't necessarily lead to anything. But knowing the difference between your own intelligence and somebody handing you a set of things that you should believe. Learning at least that it's important to understand their motivations, their intentions, where those beliefs derive from, and then having a set of questions to make sure that what they give to you is also equally important and meaningful to you. As a result of that, I'm a very, very strong advocate in freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and the danger of banned books. The danger of banning books from students and in creating the idea that literature must be confined in what its purpose, or that somebody else is going to define the purpose of literature and confine who has access to it. I ask people now and they say, "Oh, you were a great kid. You were so well behaved." But that's, I think, because now I've achieved a certain kind of success. So they remember things differently. Their memory is warped. And I have a writer's memory, which makes everything worse than maybe it actually was. I think I was a gloomy kid. I was trying to behave, trying to be good. I really, really loved my father, and he was, my mentor in a way, so I wanted to please him a lot. My mother said I was a clingy kid until I was about 4. And I also remember that from the age of 8, she and I fought almost every day. I remember that when I was 6, starting at the age of 6, I had thoughts of suicide. My first suicide attempt was with a butter knife, so it didn't really, it hurt, and then I stopped. But, the fact that I had those thoughts when I was very young was an indication that I was a very gloomy kid. I had some ways of thinking that were not healthy. I loved to read. I was solitary. And then later I became a rebellious kid. There's one side of me that wanted to behave and to hear a voice that was God's voice saying, "Amy, I have a mission for you. You are going to go out and save this country." On the other hand, I wanted to go out and be a rebel and wind up in jail, which is what I almost did. And I think that other side, the rebellious side, came about because I never thought I was going to hear the voice of God, and that I'd never be able to get any kind of mission. So if it couldn't be good enough for God or for my family or for my mother, my father, I might as well be bad. And that I could succeed in. The year after my father died, after my father and brother died, my mother took us to Europe. And there, away from everybody, away from the past, away from people who always thought I was this nerdy little girl, I exploded into a wild thing. I shortened my skirts, I put on makeup, I hung out with hippies. I got myself a first boyfriend who was a German man who was 26 or 24, I was 16. And it turned out, much to my delight, that he was also the father of an illegitimate child, which made him even more despicable in my mother's eyes. And anything that my mother hated, that was better. He deserted from the German army, and I found out later, not simply from its army, but the mental hospital. And my mother was convinced that this man was going to ruin me. And I can tell her to this day, she still doesn't believe this today. I swear on camera, this man did nothing more than kiss me. I wasn't that stupid. I mean, I knew he was pretty low. But it was exciting. First romance, the guy wrote beautiful love poetry. And I just wanted somebody to think I was special at that age. Well, it turned out that his friends were into dealing in drugs, hashish or marijuana and something. And I hung around with these people, and here's a girl who went to church every single day, Bible study, choir practice, youth sessions. And I go into this environment where I know nothing about anything. I start smoking, I start drinking. People roll hashish in their cigarettes. I think, well, that's part of it all. And I end up getting arrested. Well, this was a moment in my life when I thought for sure my life was over. And I think I understand those kids who have reached a point in their lives where they've made a few mistakes. And it looks like people are never going to change their opinion of who they are. And they're relying on everybody else's opinion of who they are. And they can't change the fact they made this really stupid mistake. So they're just going to keep going that way. You think I'm bad? You think I'm bad now? I can be really bad. That's the direction I could have taken. And fortunately, I didn't. I had a chance, for one thing, to move away and not tell anybody what had happened, to start over again. And I look back, and it's wonderful to be able to look back and kind of talk about that humorously. But I tell you, it was a horrible, horrible time thinking my life was over then. That all chances of ever going to college, of having a decent life, of being respected, of, that was gone. I reached a point where I had infuriated my mother so much. I mean, we nearly killed each other, literally. And I was sick to my stomach, literally. I had dry heaves. And the pain was so enormous that at one point, when I thought I was going to die, I just suddenly realized that scared me. And it was scary to live, but it was scarier to die. And I remember just saying, I want to live, I want to live, I want to live. And that some strength, it's hard to describe what it is, you just start to pull through and do things. I still did things, a lot of things out of anger for a while. And I was lucky that I met a very kind person, a very good person. And that person is now my husband. He was a very sweet man, and I wasn't in love with him when I first met him, but I knew he was a good person. I said, this is the kind of person my father was. And 4 years later, I married Lou, and we've been together ever since. So we've been together for 26 years. He's been my stability in life. I also learned to forgive myself. And that enabled me to forgive my mother as a person, just realizing, no, she wasn't a perfect mother. But, a lot of the things she did, she really did do out of love. Maybe they weren't the right things to do, but a lot of really was out of love. And once I realized that and stopped taking it as a personal attack to torture me and make my life miserable, then I could look beyond it. I could look at it with even some humor eventually. And, that's helped. But I also have to say, that throughout the years, I'm somebody who's, I think, had a difficult childhood, that throughout the years, it's not as though I came to one crisis, overcame that, and the rest of my life was smooth and perfect, and here I am. I'm happy. I think life is a continual series of bumps and crises, and you think you're never going to get over a hurdle, and you get over it, and you enter into what one writer, Richard Ford, calls the period of existence. And that's when you survive. That's when you can look back on what's just happened and you make sense of it, and you grow, you stagnate, or you go back down, but it's your period of existence. But the hurdles, the conflicts, those really are momentary, and you get over them, and you see what happens afterwards. Well, I think that the conflicts that are there are both cultural and generational. They're cultural if you were raised biculturally, and in this day and age, who's not? I mean, even if you're not, if your family is of one culture, you're around people of many different cultures, and so you see different cultural expectations going on all around you. But I think the cultural ones can sometimes confuse the generational ones. And I'll give you an example. You know, like if my mother didn't want me to date boys out of fear that somehow I would lose myself to this boy and ruin my life, I chalked up all of her fears to Chinese fears, not generational ones. Anything that was unreasonable, I said, was Chinese. So I made the culture the scapegoat. And that's unfortunate because it made me grow up wanting to deny that part of me, that part of my family, of myself, you know, that anything that was Chinese about me made me feel ashamed, made me want to bury that, so that this, what I felt was the stronger, more independent American side could come out. And I realize now that some of the stuff that happened to me was simply the uniqueness of my family and my mother. It had nothing to do with Chinese culture. And some of it, yes, was rooted in some traditions of Chinese culture, like the use of fear in old families to keep children under control. But I think any mother worries about her daughter losing herself to some boy, you know, and ruining her life. So there was a mix of things. Well, I would say first, you're not alone. You're absolutely not alone. And I thought I was, and I didn't realize it, in fact, until I wrote the Joy Luck Club, and I had so many readers who said, I feel as though you've written my life. That was how I felt. And I thought, well, that's probably what happened to people who grew up in the 50s and the 60s, and it's probably not happening today because we've progressed in the United States beyond that. But no, I find I have a lot of young people coming up to me and say, that's how I felt. That's how I still feel. And I don't get along with my mother, and, you know, I'm the only kid in an all-white community, and I feel, you know, like I don't know, am I Chinese, am I American, am I Korean, what should I be, how should I feel about this? And I guess what I would say to that person is, it's hard to believe, but this feeling changes over time. And so many people feel this way, and it's normal to feel conflicted. And what you'll find ultimately is that this whole question of who you are is a very, very interesting question. And having two cultures to add to the mix of it makes it even more interesting. And the strange thing is, if you ever have a chance to go back to the country of your parents or your ancestors, you'll find out not how Chinese or Korean or Indian or whatever you are. You'll find out how American you are. You'll find out how many American assumptions you have, and it'll give you a sense of perspective and humor about the whole idea that identity is what you create. It's not foisted upon you. You're presented with circumstances in life, and those circumstances change very rapidly. It's amazing to me to see, here I am, and I had said to myself when I was 17, I'm not going to have anything to do with anything Chinese when I leave home. I'm going to be completely American. And, you know, none of that Chinese torture or guilt ever again in my life. None of that responsibility crap, you know, and you owe it to your family. You have to do this for your family. I was never going to speak to my mother again. She was disappointed in me. Well, I wasn't going to be around to disappoint her anymore. So if you were to say to me when I was 17 years old, you know, one day you're going to write a book about Chinese people and how about your relationship with your mother and how much you love your mother and all this stuff. And I would have said, you are crazy. You are absolutely crazy. There is no way I would ever do that. Those are the kind of surprising changes that you can have in your life. And, just be open to it. And never let yourself despair that this is it, this is the way it's always going to be, never going to get along with my parents, never going to feel accepted by the other kids, never going to make it because I'm going to be held back with this enormous burden of something or other, pressure, not being good enough. God, life changes faster than you think. I was writing for businesses, and I think my mother was a little skeptical in the beginning, but fortunately, as a freelance writer, I was successful almost immediately. And so she was very proud because she measured the success in terms of money, which is what I started to do as well. And my goal then became to increase the amount of money that I made each month, not simply each year, but each month. I mean, talk about pressure to have more billable hours each month, so that by the end of my third year of being a freelance writer, I was billing 90 hours a week. I had no time to sleep. I had no life. People said I was crazy, that I was a workaholic. And I couldn't understand how it was that I had these wonderful clients and I was making all this money and I wasn't happy and I didn't feel successful. So that's when I started to write fiction. My mother then, didn't matter to her that I was writing fiction because I still had the job. I made it a goal, however, to cut back and work only 50 billable hours a week. Because my family was not a literary family, it wasn't that my interest in the fiction really wasn't something I shared with my family. No one in my family really was a reader of literary fiction. So I didn't have encouragement, but I didn't have discouragement because I don't think anybody knew what that meant. I had a business partner, who ended up cheating me, as a matter of fact. We had signed some papers to have this business together, and I worked many long hours, and one day we had a disagreement, and I said I wanted to do more writing, and he said that my strength was in project management. And I said, well, I really don't. That was like taking care of clients and doing estimates and going after contractors and collecting bills and horrible stuff. I'm not good at that, I hate that kind of thing. And he said, no, that's your strength. He says, writing is your weakest skill. I thought I can either believe him or, and just keep doing this. And I disagreed with him a little bit more forcefully. And I said, well, I get to decide too, because I'm a partner in this. He says, no, you're not. And I said, what do you mean, no, I'm not? He said, I never signed the papers. So at that point, I said I was quitting. He says, you can't quit. I'm firing you. And I said, go ahead, fire me. And, this is my adversity. This is a low point in my life. And he says, so what do you think you're going to do? And I said, I'm going to freelance write. And he says, oh, fat chance. You'll be lucky if you make a dime. And with that bit of, kick of a send-off into the world, I was so determined to make it as a writer. I worked day and night, trying to build my business, thinking of writing this business plan and thinking how I could do this. So in that sense, it was adversity that made me force myself to be successful in that kind of writing. Now, the other writing, fiction writing, there's so many people, and in part, I would say that it's people I don't even know. Sometimes I think it's the ghost of my grandmother, the spirit of my grandmother, who never had a life of her own, who never had choices of her own, who was raped and forced to become a concubine, who killed herself because she had no other way to escape, who had no choice in the kind of life she was given could not make her own living. And I think she said, you have this choice, and you can change the past. You can do all these things. I also had a friend who introduced me to a writer. And at the time I was doing the business writing, this woman was a fiction writer. And my friends said, well, you could meet this woman and tell her how to make some real money doing writing. And instead I said to the woman, I've been thinking of doing some fiction writing myself. If I wrote something, would you read it? I recall this now laughing because it's the question I hate hearing the most, Oh my God, here's somebody who's just starting out and it's going to be dreadful and you're going to have to try to find some way to let them, be encouraged but kind of try to help them and be truthful. And she said, sure. And she was wonderful. She read my stuff and she was very gentle and also very, very encouraging. And I kept writing. I think the question for me is how am I affected by praise? I'm more fearful of praise these days because I think I don't want to depend on it. In the world of book publishing, there is never a comfortable balance point where you either have enough praise or enough criticism, or if you get this kind of review, then you worry about what's going to happen with the next. So there's never any comfort point. On the other hand, I welcome criticism when I'm writing my books. I want to become better and better as a writer. So I go to a writer's group every week. We read our work aloud, and they're old friends, and they treat me as an equal in the group, meaning they tear my stuff apart like anybody else's. But I think what I fear the most is either taking seriously the criticism, meaning the negative criticism of reviewers, or the extremely positive reviews as well, and not knowing which one I should believe. It's the worst ones that stick in my mind. I mean, it's like a little mantra I hear. Not interesting, not interesting, not interesting. It's like I lie awake and I'm thinking about this and trying to block it out of my mind. It's like cat pee on my pillow, you just can't get it out. And then I also worry about those who praise my work, but for what I think are the wrong reasons. They think that I've done something mystical or wise, or that I've demystified Chinese culture. And I wasn't trying to do any of those things. Or people who say, I've done a great service in helping with generational gaps. I don't think of my work as being therapeutic or sociological or psychological, or it's not educational. I think the closest it comes to is simply being storytelling, and for others. And for myself, it's very personal. So I have a hard time accepting what is said about my work when it's kind of taken apart. So what I do these days, and I've learned after a number of years of going crazy over this, is I don't read any of the reviews. I don't read any of the interviews. And I don't watch this stuff. People send me television tapes, radio tapes, newspaper clippings. I don't read it. I do look at the photos of myself and see how I age each year and how my hairstyle changes. But I, try not to take any of that stuff seriously, because I'm afraid of then contouring my life, which is my writing, myself, toward those reactions. And I don't want to lead a reactionary life. I'm the person who's the worst at coming up with the single word, which is the reason why I write novels and not... I've never been good at multiple choice questions. or true false things, because I always want to tell a story. I always want to give exceptions to the rule. And what comes to mind is what I think about with my nieces, who are very, very smart, and they have a very smart mother, and they're so afraid to be wrong. The little girls, they're only 8 and 6, and they're already so afraid to be wrong. And I think there are a lot of people who think that's what's needed to be successful, is always being right, always being careful, always, picking the right path. And I think self-knowledge is important, and that embraces so many things. It means that when you make a mistake, you realize what it is, but at the same time, you don't beat yourself over the head for it. And you don't try to cast blame on somebody else. And you don't say, life's not fair. I worked hard for this. I deserve this. I think finding a sense of balance and a philosophy that can keep you consistent on one level when life is going to be one hell of a bumpy and exciting road, that's important. I think a spirit of generosity and kindness is extremely important, that people forget that. And in this day and age, especially with women wanting equality, and sometimes I think mistakenly using male models of success as the path they take. I think there are virtues of women that are oftentimes unique to women, and those are going to be important to the new kind of success being defined as something that makes a wonderful difference in the long term. Success not by how many billions of dollars did that company make, how many new products did you get out, but success of the magnitude that those scientists made when they pushed and pushed and pushed to prove that ozone was dangerous to the atmosphere. I think it's that kind of change. And when people measure their lives in those terms, the passion's there, the guiding principles, the self-guidance is there, and the rewards are there. The success is always there. I thought achievement when I was younger had to do with gaining approval from other people. My parents, my teachers, then higher ups, that it was a continual plateau of, it was a plateau at one level and then a continual climbing, a successive climbing of always seeking higher and higher levels of approval, and that was what achievement was. And that at the plateaus you always had to maintain the highest standards, the A's, the whatever, and be the best. And that people would give you the feedback and tell you whether you had done the achievement. And I've learned that achievement is a sense, what more importantly is a sense of oneself. And that it's never a feeling of self-satisfaction, that the people who've achieved more probably are those who always say, I don't deserve this. Because they were doing exactly what they loved to do, and what ended up being quite helpful maybe to other people, but not seeking approval, not trying to follow the ordinary way of doing things, the expected way of doing things, the accepted way of doing things. They're not aversive in their actions, and yet they know how to ruffle the system and make better things happen. Not for self-importance, but for larger reasons. That's what I hope, with achievement. When I look at achievement, when I look at a sense of achievement, and I look at external success and internal success, I always have to keep those things in mind. And I know, for example, the external success has to do with that there will be people who see me as a model or an example or a representative. And as much as I may dislike or want to reject that responsibility, that, this is something that comes with that public success. And then, well, that's important. It's important mostly, I think, to give others a sense of hope that it is possible, and you can come from really different places in the world and find your own place in the world that's unique for yourself. There are all these people out there, so many people looking for the same kind of happiness, the same kind of success, the same kind of comforts. And some people are going to lose out. But also there might be some compromises that are made in the world. And it's not simply material ones or environmental ones. I worry about ethical ones, moral ones, the kinds of compromises that are constantly being made for pragmatic reasons. I see this all the time in myself, dealing with, should I do this? It's just easier to go ahead and do that. And it's those little things sometimes that make me, they seem very small, but I think eventually they also erode the world, our unwillingness to compromise. And that it all leads to the big picture. So, I worry about that within myself. I worry about the contradictions, and I know it's part of human nature to have contradictions, to believe one thing logically and to believe another emotionally, and to do quite another for other pragmatic reasons. And there are other, you have a contradiction and you want, for example, that all people should have freedom of expression. And when you carry that to religious point of view, you realize different people have beliefs about life after death and karma and reincarnation and damnation and salvation or nothing, and that these beliefs affect how we act in the here and now. How do we feel about abortion rights or the right to die or the death penalty? And that those beliefs influence what we do, not simply in those larger issues, but then what we think we're contributing to the world, for what period of time and for whom. So I just wonder about this very large morass of beliefs and how muddled they're getting, especially as the world gets more crowded, but also much more international, where a mix of things must coexist. I guess I think about the ideas, the emotions, the desires that go behind that. There's so many things I would like to do. I would like to go trekking into Nepal. I would like to write a song. I'd like to breed Yorkies. Sometimes I think I'd like to be a interior decorator. There's so many things, but the nice thing about being a writer is if I can't do all of those things, all I have to do is imagine them and put them in a story, and then that's, second place, but it's pretty good. I go back to this idea that I only discovered when I was older, and I wish I knew it when I was younger, because I think I missed a lot of observations in life, and that is to develop your own philosophy. I always thought philosophy was one of the most useless subjects in the world. It was existentialism and, how things work. But I think it's extremely important in how you perceive the world and your place in the world, and, the idea that what happens in the world, is it luck? Is it fate? Is it coincidence? Is there a pattern to history? Do things repeat themselves? What is it about human nature that is inherited versus self-determined? All of those things are so important in how you're going to be able to deal with the changes that happen in life, how you deal with your successes, your failures, with love, with loss. And so apart from all those very tangible, discrete goals, I think it's nice to start off with the framework of what that philosophy might encompass. Nobody can tell you what it is. It's uniquely your own. And you put the things in the basket that you want. The questions you want, the things that are important, the values, the ideas, the emotions. And you look at it from time to time and see if it's staying the same or if it's changing. And it's a wonderful way to observe life, because so much of life is not simply getting from step to step, but it's the things you discover about yourself and others around you, relationships. And it's fascinating. That makes every life worth living. It makes you see in everybody you meet, no matter how much you respect or disrespect them, that their life is uniquely theirs and deserves some consideration too. It makes life fascinating and a wonder. How old are these grandkids? I really have this sounds like a very selfish thing, a very egocentric thing. I would read them probably a book that I've written. If they were young, I would read them The Moon Lady or The Chinese Siamese Cat, and if they were older, I would read them The Joylet Club or The Kitchen God's Wife or The 100 Secret Senses, because the things that I would want to say to my grandchildren, if I had them, are the things that I had wanted to say to myself when I was younger. Exactly those things. And it's not out of any self-pride that these are better stories or words. These are the things that are important to me and my family. My books, my stories are about families. And so why wouldn't I tell them the things that I thought were important to our family that are in my books? It took me a long time to understand what the American dream was. I always thought that what it was is that things get better and better and better, and you have every right to have things get better and better, and equal opportunity and all of that. My parents took it literally. We moved from 41st to 51st to 61st Street in Oakland, and Highland Avenue. I mean, we were going higher and higher up in the world. And I realize now the most important thing that is an American dream, in looking at people living in other countries and looking at the life my sisters had not growing up in this country, is the American freedom to create your own identity. And I think that's uniquely American. In no other country do you have that opportunity. It's not to say that everything will happen fairly and as the way that you want, but that I think this is the country where that opportunity to be as wild as you want, as generous as you want, as crazy as you want, as artistic as you want, that all of that, the whole range exists, and we have a constitution, a tradition, a culture that supports that. I hope it continues to support that. I hope it especially continues to support the arts in that direction. But is that self-determination of your identity to define what it means to be an American, and that nobody defines that for you.